I'm very grateful that you're here. Welcome. This is the third meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club for this semester. The Socratic Club is in the middle of celebrating its 20th anniversary. I can't believe it myself. The Socratic Club has existed on Gonzaga's campus now since 2004. Again, I'm just very thankful that you all are here to engage in a little bit of intellectual conversation. The Socratic Club, I founded the Socratic Club in 2004 in part to address a sense that I had, maybe wrong, but a sense that I had that student understanding of issues in especially philosophical theology was uneven. And so I created a forum where we can talk about Christian worldview issues in a broadly philosophical way. And so we have talks on a huge variety of subjects, theological, like the problem of evil, the classical problem of evil, Christianity and popular culture. We've just had a couple of talks this semester about the recent film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and the moral message that it's communicating, and so on and so forth. I could keep going, but you get the idea. You might have wondered, why Socratic Club? Well, we do revere Socrates as someone who follows the argument wherever it leads, but I can't claim that this was an original idea of my own. The Gonzaga Socratic Club is named after the Oxford Socratic Club, which existed on the Oxford campus in the middle years of the 1900s. And it was presided over by a pretty famous person that you've probably heard of, C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia Chronicles, who was a professor of literature at Oxford, in addition to being the author of children's books and also a very popular public apologist for Christianity. And so that's the story behind the name of the club. The club does not have a private membership list or a secret handshake or anything like that. If you want to join, look it up on the website, and I'll add you to you can be added to the mailing list to find out about future activities. So tonight we are very fortunate to have a talk by Chandler Rogers, lecturer in the Gonzaga Philosophy Department, who's going to be talking about cosmological persons bringing healing down to earth. His subject is looking at the question of human nature, philosophical anthropology, in connection with our place in nature and the cosmos, our relations to other human beings and to other living things. Dr. Rogers has been here a lecturer in the Gonzaga Philosophy Department for a year and a half. He has degrees from Biola University, Loyola Marymount University, and Boston College. His research focuses on the subject of his talk tonight, on understanding the human place in nature in relation to God and to other creatures. This includes reference to contemporary questions concerning the nature of the human animal, our animality, and the ethical status of other animals and our shared environment, in addition to thinking more broadly about environmental philosophy. We'll have a commentator later on who I'll introduce to you, but with that, let's begin, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Rogers. Please welcome him.
Well, thank you to Dr. David Calhoun and the Gonzaga Socratic Club for this invitation to present some, broadly, I guess I could call it research. It's really synthesizing some themes, topics that I've been thinking about over the past few years before you all. I'm grateful for the opportunity for the intellectual camaraderie. I'm also grateful to Dan in advance for his comments. These are topics that Dan and I have been talking about for a number of years now, and it's really ironic to be here in this room after, as a graduate student, for quite a few years, coming to the philosophy conference, a graduate philosophy conference, and attending presentations in this very room and talking with Dan about these very topics. So it's quite organic the way these conversations have developed between Dan and I. My topic is cosmological persons, bringing healing down to earth. And I have to, if you read the abstract, I've got to do some damage control and apologize in advance for the big alliterated A section titles and so problems and responses that just are going to be a burden to keep saying over and over again. But hopefully I'll give some definitions that help. Almost all who write on the climate emergency are rightly critical of the hubris or pride that has led our species to become a particularly parasitic guest to the earth, our host. But the answer to human hubris cannot simply be to emphasize that our species is no different from any other. That's going to be the tack that I'm taking. Typically, responses to the climate crisis emphasize our animality and sort of raise other animals up to the same level as human beings. I'm emphasizing our unique human responsibility. And I've been inspired in part, very implicitly, by reading and teaching Lewis's Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. I should step back for a second and say this is a chapter I worked on last spring for an edited volume. That's edited by a philosopher that Dan and I both know, and it includes reference to a number of themes in his work. And so the language of hosting and guests and hosts are themes that appear in Richard Carney's work, and that's who's editing this volume, along with the emphasis on a carnality. He calls it a carnal hermeneutics. And so I'll if that language sounds strange to you, it's against the background of what the larger project is doing in the edited volume. So the answer to human hubris cannot be simply to emphasize that our species is no different from any other. This too easily becomes an excuse to perpetuate the harms that we are already inflicting. We are different. We are uniquely responsible for the climate emergency to clean up the mess that we have made. That mess, I contend, is a personal mess. Personal, as in personalism, and I'll give some background in a second. That emergency is a personal emergency. As such, ecological healing would require addressing directly three all-too-human tendencies that have been exacerbated in the modern period. And those are the three A problems that I'll reference in a second. As persons, we are irreducibly unique subjects on the one hand, who exist essentially in relation to one another on the other hand. Typically, that second point has referred to the social dimension of our personhood, our existence in relation to other people, other persons. But largely obscured in the more recent history of Western thought is the cosmological dimension of our personhood, our existence in relation not just to other humans, but also to other animals, plants, and ecosystems. This is the sense in which we, as persons, exist as part of the larger cosmos, conceived as a meaningful whole. To reconnect, there's the cosmological dimension of our personhood that's been underemphasized. To reconnect to the cosmological dimension of our personhood, we must learn to resist the anesthetizing, alienating, and anonymizing, there are three A's, tendencies that have characterized the recent history of our species. And those will be my three sections. In what follows, I propose three remedies to these three kinds of sickness. We need to recultivate sensitivity towards aestheticization, to get back in touch with, this word's going to be a tricky one, anacarnation, and I'll explain that one when it comes up, and to speak out on behalf of attestation, the wild plants, animals, and ecosystems that have been forced to the periphery of human society. Yet the aim of our critique cannot be mere disdain for technoscientific control and the domination of anonymous market forces. Our goal must be twofold, kind of a thesis here. To regain touch with our animality by embracing the earth that hosts us, thus becoming more gracious guests, and to become more fully human by becoming better hosts to the multitude of Earth's creatures whose lives hang in the balance. Section 1, anesthetization. Anesthetization is the state of having become insensitive to pain or suffering, and more broadly, to that which stimulates the senses. It includes reference also to a cultural crisis in aesthetics, or to the modern victory of scientific knowing and the objectification of all that is not mind over embodied ways of knowing. The latter are in fact integral components of a largely absent complement to scientific objectification, tactful philosophical knowing. Reintegration of the latter would require a healthy dose of aesthetic sensibility, or in other words, aestheticization. I brought a few props with me. They're books. I'm a philosopher, so I bring books everywhere. The first one is Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. And you'll notice that the image on the screen, this painting by Paul Cézanne, is on the cover of this recent edition of the Phenomenology of Perception. And Merleau-Ponty is informing all of the thinking that I'm doing here, although I'm going beyond him, taking a lot of liberty. We have become anesthetized to the living world that beckons to us from beyond our societal constructs. From the onset, our embodied responses are solicited, that's Merleau-Ponty, through the heightening of our senses. But the affective primacy of touch has been gradually eclipsed by the abstract blessedness of sight. That's the project of this carnal hermeneutics that's informing the background. Richard Carney, our mutual friend, Brian Traynor as well. An aesthetic way of being in which a subject connects meaningfully to its surrounding world has been displaced by an objectivizing gaze. Here's a quote from the philosopher Neil Evernden, environmental philosopher. He says, "Aesthetics is a way of being, a stance toward the world. An aesthetic experience requires a relationship between a seeking subject and a responsive world. But scenery is a stockpile of usable commodities." That stockpile of usable commodities, that's according to this objectification that I'm referencing. End quote. One byproduct of the shift toward objectivistic knowing is that plants, animals, and their surrounding biotic environments now blend into a scene to be viewed from outside and above. Earth's wild places become spectacles to be viewed on occasion rather than being a living theater inviting us to participation. Aristotle does attend carefully to touch, by contrast with Plato. But like Plato, he also famously argues at the opening of his Metaphysics that sight is the most blessed of the senses. Sight takes in the scene all at once, as touch struggles to grasp the whole. But while blessed rationality strives, perhaps inevitably, I'll talk about that in a second, toward an ultimate perspective on things, human limitations prevent us from ever wholly attaining to the God's eye view. The great danger has been that when we come close to such a blessed standpoint, our own animality is utterly neglected or repressed, or perhaps falsely claimed to have been overcome. The wonders of touch and its tactful attention to detail and particularity are overlooked. Modern science in particular tends to hypostasize sight over and against touch, and to prize objectification over value-laden knowing. But perhaps this situation presents, in part, a necessary predicament. The phenomenologist Max Scheler, in On the Eternal in Man, suggests that scientific knowing is contingent upon the following moral precondition. So scientific knowing is contingent, he suggests, upon the following moral precondition. Quote, "Self-mastery must be achieved. In this way, it is possible to objectify the instinctual impulses of life, which are given and experienced as of the flesh, and which must needs exert a constant influence on natural sensory perception." End quote. Scheler suggests that one's scientific knowledge will be more or less adequate in proportion to the extent of one's mastery over instinctual impulses and desires. That objective knowledge of things will correspond to the degree to which the scientist has been able to suspend subjective desires and intentions. But after centuries of practice, these modes of subjectivity have been effectively buried under what the eco-phenomenologist Erzine Kohak, in this book, The Embers in the Stars, Philosophical Inquiry into the Moral Sense of Nature, calls, quote, "a heavy layer of forgetting." This is the first book in the field called eco-phenomenology. It's applying the insights from Shaler's field of phenomenology to natural experience in the natural world. In the face of significant disagreement about values, whether amidst the cultural upheavals of the 17th century with Descartes, or in the context of increasing globalization and techno-democratic assertions toward individual authority in the 21st century, in our time, scientific objectivity has taken absolute epistemic precedence, it seems to me, thus overriding the meaning-laden dimension of more subject-dependent insights concerning value, empathy, and virtue. And that's where Shaler comes in. He's emphasizing this more subject-dependent realm of knowledge. If self-mastery can be defined as, quote, the domination of the instinctual impulses by the rational will, end quote, then in acts of scientific knowing, the possibility of instrumentalization is already implicit. The possibility of manipulating and controlling the entity or entities in question for the sake of some desired end. Without further moral qualification, the scientific knower is especially tempted toward the manipulation of the objects of his knowledge, quote, and this is Shaler again, by means of a rational will, which is itself guided, but also bound by possible anthropocentric or human-centered aims and values, end quote. Shaler contrasts scientific knowing with its missing counterpart, philosophical knowing. Here's a block quote from Shaler. It is not by chance, but in the nature of things, that even the scientist's basic moral attitude to the world and his task in it is, and should be, totally different from that of the philosopher. In positive research, the scientist's will to know is primarily inspired by a will to master, and, thence arising, a will to order the whole of nature. It is for that very reason that laws, in obedience to which nature lets herself be governed, represent the highest goal of his endeavor. What interests him, the scientist, is not what the world is, but how it may be considered as constructed, so that within the scope of this highest goal, it may be regarded as practically modifiable. Scientific knowing must be counterbalanced by the wisdom of a more holistic approach offered by philosophical knowing, which occurs also only on the condition of the kind of moral self-mastery described earlier. Tempering the will to control and modify, however, are two additional moral preconditions. First, says Shaler, in philosophical knowing, quote, the whole spiritual person must love absolute value and being, end quote. Second, the natural self and ego must be humbled. It is by way of these two requirements, love of absolute value and being, and humbling of the natural self or ego, that the philosopher's way of knowing can help to moderate the unbridled and exalted techno-scientific will to mastery. An aestheticized love of wisdom, which remains faithful to the earth, kind of modified sense of Nietzsche's Zarathustra's words, remaining faithful to the earth, will resist an otherworldly drive, the otherworldly drive currently fueling civilizational pursuits toward endless excess. Renewed aesthetic sensibility can help to introduce a healthy dose of humility into our cultural projects, with an eye to reversing the markedly noxious results of our more recent tenure as parasitic guests to the earth. Section 2, alienation, the second A. Alienation is a state of estrangement from the earth, from animality, and from what is most deeply human. Our age of excarnation, that term will come up a few times, excarnation, and I'll give a definition for it in a couple of slides. Our age of excarnation is marked by increasing individualism and the loss of deep and meaningful relations to one another, but even more dramatically to the earth, and especially to Earth's wild places. As persons, we are irreducibly unique and essentially relational. Consumptive individualism and excessive objectivism have exaggerated the former while eroding the latter. Here's a big one. Anacarnation presents an important response to this predicament. a return to the joys of embodied life, purged of sentimentalism, without rejecting the technological advances that authentically enhance what is best in and around us. I'll give I'll give an explanation of this term anacarnation and an excarnation in a few slides at the end of this section. Looking on as an outsider at the modern alliance of state power and technoscientific progress, Nietzsche asks in his third untimely meditation, now, how does the philosopher view the culture of our time? This is the early Nietzsche in his book Untimely Meditations, speaking as an untimely one, criticizing the excesses of the culture of his day in the 1870s at the time, and essentially setting up some of the problems that he'll respond to in his later works. But this reading from Nietzsche, perhaps like a reading from the early Marx, is a bit unlike what you'd expect to hear from Nietzsche. So a couple quotes from him. The philosopher steps back and questions. When he thinks of the haste and hurry now universal, of the increasing velocity of life, of the cessation of all contemplativeness and simplicity, he almost thinks that what we are seeing, or what he is seeing, are the symptoms of a total extermination and uprooting of culture, end quote. I'm going to paraphrase this block quote, but maybe you can read along. He says that the waters of religion are receding, and the nations are preparing to destroy one another. He wasn't that far off, just a few decades later, World War I. Scientific inquiry is pursued without restraint and at any cost. Its findings undermining firmly held beliefs. Educated persons are swept along in the currents of a hugely contemptible money economy. The greed of the moneymakers and the greed of the state have co-opted the counterbalancing force of culture. So he sees those early on as two counterbalancing forces, the greed of the state and culture, to their own ends. So that now education is geared on the one hand toward, quote, and this is later in the same text, toward making money as easily as possible, end quote. And on the other hand, towards the state's, quote, advantage in its competition with other states, end quote. Nowadays, this is Nietzsche again. Nowadays, the crudest and most evil forces, the egoism of the moneymakers and the military despots, hold sway over almost everything on earth. If I could go back for a second, at the end of this block quote, he emphasizes, the world has never been more worldly, never poorer in love and goodness. That's a bit unlike the Nietzsche that we all have come to know, or that most of us have come to know. The world has never been more worldly, never poorer in love and goodness. While capitalist consumerism exalts the individual's private wants and desires, often above the common good of the collective, the greed of the state at times sacrifices the true flourishing of its members as part of a larger body to the competitive advantage of the state ego. Today, we could say that we are seeing a synthesis of the 20th century extremes of capitalist individualism and communist or totalitarian collectivism in the modern military-driven nation state. Fueled by the individualized self-interest that drives its consumer economy, and steered by the egoism of belligerent pilots is maybe not too far off. Here I'm referring to the Republic, Socrates' image in book 6, I believe, of the ship run by drunken sailors. There is no unifying substantive vision of the good to guide. All meaningful connections to the larger cosmos have been eroded. The theater in which these theatrics play out, the Earth, and the atmospheric conditions that have made human civilization possible are devastated in the process. This is to our own peril, and to the peril of species, individuals, and poorer nations that shoulder the unwelcome effects of our combined actions. Nietzsche asks, in response to the predicament of his day, who is there then, amid these dangers of our era, to guard and champion humanity? In our modified sense, who is there to challenge the status quo and to champion human responsibility? It is ours alone to become more gracious guests of the earth and better hosts to the creatures whose fates are now more than ever in our collective hands. We must become more attentive to the needs and struggles of those out of sight and out of mind. We are connected more now than ever socially, and convenience is literally at our fingertips for the first time in history. We can contact anyone at any time, and within hours, nearly anything can be delivered at the doorstep. Yet we are perhaps more isolated and less satisfied now than ever before in our recorded history. Just a presumption on my part. Our callousness begins in childhood. And here's a quote from a mutual friend, Melissa Fitzpatrick. She says, in terms of the world as we understand it today, embedded in the age of excarnation, again, I'll define that in a minute, capitalism fueled by competition, and the speed at which we need to move to keep up makes us callous early on. We are less attentive to what is beyond ourselves, less stifled by the pain of the other, less empathetic altogether, end quote. The price of rapid techno-scientific advancement is hyper-individualism, exacerbating the unquestioned consequences of an unrestrained consumer culture. The things and systems that we've built around ourselves, by and large, haven't been constructed with the fullness of our humanity in view. These instead are largely the result of national quests for military expansion, serving lust for power, and unregulated market forces, serving to meet the often unruly demands of unchecked appetites and desires. In addition to aestheticization from the first section, as a sensitizing response to the modern problem of anesthetization, we would do well to embrace anacarnation as a tactful response to the predicament of postmodern or perhaps posthumanist excarnation. Anacarnation is a secondary return to the primary wonders of embodiment, having passed through the night of excarnation. It is a recovery of the joys of incarnation without jettisoning the best that our technologies have to offer. It means calling into question the thoughtlessness with which so much of our technology has been constructed, along with the assumption that if we can build something, then we should. And if it can be mass-produced, then every consumer should have one. Finally, a definition of excarnation. It's from Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Late in this work, where he's moving from about the year 1500 to today and tracing the development of our secular age, he places this neologism, this new label, on the digital age that we're currently in. It's a term used to criticize the bleaker consequences of our digital age, whereby disembodied interactions through digital technologies are increasingly taking the place of more holistic, embodied interactions between persons. So you can see the setup a little bit, maybe like an original incarnation, age of excarnation, where our relations to one another are increasingly disembodied. And then this term, another made-up word, neologism, anacarnation, is a return to incarnation, having passed through that middle stage, the night of excarnation, and with sort of incarnation being purged of more sentimental tendencies. So it's without jettisoning the best that our technologies have to offer. It's incorporating the best technologies that make us more fully human. It's incarnation on the other side of excarnation. Let me go back one. Anacarnation would not require simply leaving the city never to return again, but rather getting in touch with the biotic life already thriving within the city. It would require that cultivation in both built environments and biotic environments, both the city and the countryside, take place more thoughtfully. It would mean developing technologies that assist in securing what we actually need as embodied human persons of a species with a long biological history, arising from deepened understanding of ourselves as contemplative human animals. We need, therefore, to consult the wisdom of those most in touch with the earth, its animals, and each other. Perhaps, especially the wisdom of indigenous and also non-Western traditions. We need massive demands for change and justice on the part of holistically educated citizens. These conditions would require, in turn, supporting education that touches to the heart of who and what we are as persons by addressing both the interpersonal and cosmological dimensions of our personhood. Section 3, anonymization. Final big A word, I promise. Anonymity refers to a state in which the lack of personal identification predominates. To anonymize, in our sense, is to render nameless. It is to speak of abstract universals like species or ecosystems without engaging in subjective embodied relations to actually existing individuals. It corresponds to, from section 1, anesthetization or scientific knowing, valued over philosophical knowing in Shaler's sense, and to objectification in the absence of appreciation for the value of the being of other creatures, and in the absence of humbled human acknowledgement of our unique responsibility to care. It coincides with alienation from section 2, with a perverse coercion of culture by the state-led alliance of consumptive greed and the lust for power. Anonymization is actively resisted by the counterbalancing force of attestation, whereby we come to recognize the invaluable thisness, or haecceitas, of each living creature. The objectivistic gaze, a necessary component of scientific knowing, has been especially helpful, for instance, in the objective study of the body in medicine, as one example. But when technological advancement and the scientific quest for knowledge were finally wedded in the early modern period, the prideful or hubristic human project of becoming masters and possessors of nature soon became powered by a combustion engine. Industrialization, exploitation of expendable workers and non-humans, and large-scale pollution became ideologically unacknowledged elements of that project. Previously, scientific investigation was reserved for those having the time for leisurely investigation, when the whole endeavor was known as natural philosophy. Technology was the domain of those dedicated to daily labors, typically by hand, where innovation served to facilitate this work. But in early modernity in theory, and later in the modern period in practice, technological advancement gradually allied itself with the new scientific enterprise. Here's a quote from a famous article by Lynn White Jr., the historian, that essentially helped to spark the field of environmental ethics. He says, "It was not until about 4 generations ago," and he was writing in 1963, 4 generations ago, that Western Europe and North America arranged a marriage between science and technology, a union of the theoretical and empirical approaches to our natural environment. The emergence and widespread practice of the Baconian creed that scientific knowledge means technological power over nature can scarcely be dated before about 1850, save in the chemical industries where it is anticipated in the 18th century. Its acceptance as a normal pattern of action may mark the greatest event in human history since the invention of agriculture. Maybe a side note, in this article, Lynn White Jr. famously criticizes Christianity for being this plague upon the environment through laying the groundwork for the early modern creed that we should become masters and possessors of nature. But at the end, he suggests that St. Francis should be the patron saint of ecology in 1967. So he kind of is like, yeah, he's criticizing Christianity writ large and then saying, but St. Francis did well. And we could look to him as an example, just in the last two pages of that article. So maybe I'm taking a little bit of the spirit of that last section from Lynn White Jr. We can see the foundations for this wedding in Bacon's early modern scientific creed, to be sure, but of greater consequence for our purposes is the Cartesian marriage, that's Descartes, of philosophical with scientific knowing, in Shaler's terms, philosophical with scientific knowing, namely Descartes' Metaphysical Physics, to cite the title of a relevant work by Dan Garber. Rather than counterbalancing the objectivistic pursuit of knowledge with grounded philosophical knowing, which keeps in close moral contact with both the love of value and being and the necessity of humbling the self or ego, Descartes subordinates, according to the definitions offered in the first section, philosophical to scientific knowing. All that is not mind is relegated by Descartes to the status of extension, as that which can be objectified and measured. Extended things can then be manipulated, controlled, and dominated by the human will. And of course, non-human animals bear the brunt of this theoretical shift. Like human bodies apart from the mind, they are now thought to operate mechanistically. So they can be cut open while alive, tortured in the name of scientific knowing, and eventually industrially raised in mass quantities and consumed as a daily necessity without second thought. Here's a kind of double metaphor in this Cage of Lions painting with that Cartesian background in mind, a double metaphor for both our own neglected animality and, in a sense, and sort of the consequences for animals outside of us. In our age, the philosopher must be called to think carefully about the unquestioned values and overweening hubris or pride behind so many of our inventions, expansions, and acquisitions. This would require seeking out the advice of those for whom, quote, the whole spiritual person has come to love absolute value and being, and for whom the natural self and ego has been radically humbled. I add that these together should lead toward an attitude of reverence, toward the recognition of and attestation to the invaluable thisness or haecceitas of each living creature. This would entail both becoming animal, and there's a nod to a concept that's really popular in environmental circles. So it would mean both becoming animal and becoming more fully human at one and the same time. It would mean first attending to, then attesting to, especially through aesthetic media in preparation for actual contact, the neglected haecceitas or thisness of those who have been anonymized in our age, not least of all our depersonalized and exploited animal kin. Here's my conclusion. At the heart of the climate emergency is a loss of awareness of the cosmological dimension of our personhood, driven by insatiable desire and condemned to construct without any real vision of ecological harmony to guide our development. For 5 centuries, the human animal has been exalting itself to its own imminent destruction. With our material constructions, we isolated ourselves from wildness, danger, and surprise. With our immaterial constructions, we have further isolated ourselves from each other, from both human and non-human animality, and from the earth that hosts our pursuits. In other words, we've exaggerated our own individual uniqueness, almost at the expense of the social dimension of our personhood, and almost certainly at the expense of the cosmological dimension of our personhood. There have been, of course, unquestionable gains with each technoscientific advance, but in the age of excarnation, we have alienated ourselves from the meaning-saturated world that exists beyond our objectivistic ways of knowing, and which subsists beneath or behind our societal constructions. Only once we find healing and accept our unique creaturely responsibility can we offer healing to the animals whose general well-being is now more than ever in our hands, to the plants and ecosystems that sustain our relations to all living things, and to one another as members of one human family. Ecological degradation is a personal problem, rooted in human desires and self-understanding, or maybe lack of self-understanding. As a personal problem, it demands a personal response. Becoming faithful to the earth would require active cultivation of the remedies I've proposed, namely aestheticization, anacarnation, and attestation. We diminish our own dignity as persons when we instrumentalize the lives of non-human creatures, when we treat with callous indifference the earth that hosts us. We become more fully human when we acknowledge that we are simultaneously guests of earth and hosts to all the living, when we accept our unique vocation first to humble ourselves and our egoism, and then to cultivate, care for, and protect the value of earth's diverse creatures and wild places. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers, very much. It is not always, but often the custom at the Socratic Club to have a respondent to help bring out some of the salient issues in talks that are given here at the club. And we do have such a respondent today. Dr. Dan Bradley from the Gonzaga Philosophy Department is going to offer a comment. I was thinking as I was listening to Dr. Rogers' presentation that there there's not a better person to respond to this than Dan Bradley. If you're focusing on embodiment and place and a sense of location, I'll just give you a little bit. Dan Bradley grew up just north of Gonzaga, came here as a student in the late 90s. Is that right? Am I remembering right? What's that? Okay, okay, mid-90s. And then went to Galway, Ireland to get his PhD, and then came back. So here's someone who's very embedded and connected to a particular context geographically, and that fits also with Dan's research interests. Dan is interested in phenomenology and human nature and hermeneutics, or philosophy of interpretation, and has a particular interest in sacramental theology and philosophy, that is a sense of how the divine is communicated through concrete reality. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Bradley, who will draw out some things in the talk for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. It's a particular pleasure to be responding to Dr. Rogers' work as a colleague now and no longer as a student. Dr. Calhoun was my teacher, and then for me to come back and give papers to my old teachers and now to be responding to a former student who's now a colleague, it's a beautiful thing and a pleasure, so thank you. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of humbling of the natural self that Dr. Rogers was talking about. But just as an introductory note, maybe we can point out that there's a great framing question at work in this paper, and that is the relation between environmental activism and philosophy. Hopefully, we're all doing whatever we can to protect creation from the threats that it faces. But sometimes people get so preoccupied with questions of policy and political activism that they argue that we can't be wasting our time on philosophy or really going to university in general. The question is, what is the relation between the intellectual life and concrete and activism? And I think it's a mistake to argue that we can do without philosophy and without the intellectual life more broadly. It's clear to me that technical solutions alone will not suffice. As Pope Francis puts it, the environmental problem is also a spiritual problem, and we need a spiritual solution to solve it. I think in a kind of a complementary vein, Dr. Rogers says that our environmental mess is a personal mess, and that our emergency is a personal emergency. But then he goes on to show that in order to have a personal relation to the world, that itself is a philosophical problem. But he doesn't see philosophy in abstract terms, and for him, doing philosophy is not playing with abstract questions or idle word games. It's never a matter of concupiscentia ocularum or a kind of idle voyeurism. For him, philosophy is a way of becoming oriented to the world in a properly ordered way. Aestheticization, anacarnation, and attestation are practices, or are on the way to becoming practices. Practices in which we cultivate our engagement with the world and our relationship with it. Now, so I think that's the first thing to kind of question here is to see how philosophy and environmental activism are related. In terms of content of the paper, I'm in close agreement with Rogers on many of these issues. We come from the same tradition, or really it's more like an apostolic laying on of hands that goes back through Richard Carney to Paul Ricoeur. And Ricoeur himself constituted this tradition by blending together phenomenology with a much more ancient tradition of biblical hermeneutics that sees the Bible in really earthy, materially symbolic ways that therefore require acts of interpretation to bring meaning to life. So we share a lot in this regard. So unfortunately, I'm pretty sympathetic. It's much more fun when you can hammer someone, but unfortunately, I can't do that today. So instead, what I want to do is I want to draw something that Rogers mentioned but didn't develop very far that I think will serve as a response to a common objection that arises in response to the kind of things that we do. Like Rogers, I argue that we need to cultivate an aesthetic relation to the world. As he said, to pay attention to that which stimulates the senses, to recover a primary connection to embodiment. But the objection says, let's make that a little more concrete. What stimulates the senses most powerfully? Well, sex and food, right? And aren't we all washed in those things as a culture? Particularly when we think about our relation to other cultures in time and history. For most of human history, we had much less access to that which stimulates the senses. So why on earth are we talking now about cultivating this in a special kind of way. Tasty food was difficult to come by. If you wanted to eat, you had to grow the food, and then you had to protect it, and then you had to store it, and then you had to harvest it and cook it. We have Dr. Alfinos here today. He can tell us lots about how hard the human relationship to food has been up until extremely recently. Now in 10 minutes, I can go buy a burger at McDonald's. For most of human history, if you wanted to have sex with someone, you had to convince them to marry you and have a child with you and go through an enormous amount of effort and time. And we seem to now have all these kinds of sensuous relations at our fingertips. Well, so what is the answer? I think the answer has to be in something like what Dr. Rogers has already mentioned, that is the humbling of the natural self. Crucially, as he shows us, this is already at work in the rigor of scientific method in a really powerful way. Science is extremely rigorous, and that rigor is a disciplining of the self. So we can quite properly call this a kind of scientific asceticism. Now, this scientific asceticism is one process, but it has two kind of interrelated aspects. The first is more epistemological. Science helps purify us of illusions, of wishful thinking and other delusions. So partly it's about content. It's about helping purify us of what we believe to be true. But the second is more personal, and it helps us train our desires to approach the world more scientifically. This self-discipline is why we require you to take a lab science at Gonzaga. You don't do the lab because we think that you're contributing to the sum total of human knowledge. And you're not learning anything in the lab either, right? You already know that the ball's going to drop at 9.8 meters per second. That's not the point. The point is the rigor of the disciplining of the ego, right? And that's why I find labs, as much as I loved science, I want to get through them. I want to find out what is the answer. But it's not about content. It's about reorienting a relation toward the world. Now, I think that's extremely successful, but we pay a high price for the rigor of scientific asceticism. The illusions of subjectivity are purified in modern science only by prescinding from questions of value. Now, that might be changing very recently, but certainly this is how we've understood science for the last 400 years. So scientific knowledge is not sufficient, but there has to be a corresponding asceticism at work in our philosophical relation to the sensuous. I think that's in his work, but I think to make it a plausible project, we have to draw that out a little bit more carefully. So let me mention two ways that material asceticism can work that I think fits with Roger's project. The first is learning to create something physical in an aesthetic mode. Learning to make a deck for your family that won't collapse the first time you have a barbecue is not at all easy. Then to make it beautiful and to make it last, we're starting to get extremely difficult. There's a great aesthetic self-discipline here in making something. You're disciplined by the materiality of the world. The materials and all their concrete conditions, the way they interact with human beings. How is the wood going to feel on bare feet? How hot is it going to be against your feet on an August day in Spokane? How is it going to last in the snow, and on and on? So I think there's a kind of aesthetic self-disciplining that comes from a concrete engagement with the materiality of the world in acts of making. And the second would be actual traditional aesthetic practices, things like abstinence and fasting. They tend to be really out of fashion at a place like Gonzaga. And certainly fasting could be done for Gnostic reasons that have to do with hatred of the body and so on. But that isn't really the main line of the tradition. Fasting was done to attain the rigor of self-detachment, precisely in order to return to the beauty of the sensuous in a properly ordered way. That's why fasting was always followed by feasting, Easter after Lent, Christmas after Advent. This aesthetic asceticism is not only going to correspond to scientific asceticism, I think it's going to help to temper it. As Roger showed us, asceticism can be used as a tool. This has been the result of much of modern science. Modern science requires self-discipline, but we pay the price in order to gain power over nature. Another way to put this is that the modern project is a purely intellectual disciplining of the self. So science cultivates humility, but it's only an epistemic humility in order to unleash unlimited aspects of the will. So I would say that a material asceticism is equally in danger of cultivating the will. This is why the Franciscans and the Dominicans had such fights about notions of absolute poverty, right? But, so alone, I don't think a material asceticism is going to be enough to be a complete practice that constitutes the good life, but it might help us to pause before the material world in a way that scientific practice does not cultivate. So maybe I just ask if Dr. Rogers, is that okay? Can I ask the first question? So do you think, Chandler, that this is a plausible part of the project as a way of ordering our relation to the material world? Thank you.
We'll hear an answer from you, and then we'll have a Q&A after that.
The short of it is yes. I do think so. Yeah. How could I not? Yeah, and in the background, I'm making so many connections as Dan's making these connections, Dr. Bradley's making these connections. For instance, one thing that I'm thinking of is Nietzsche himself recognizes that the lab coat has replaced clerical garb in the modern era. Who do we trust now? Now, popularly speaking, we trust the man in the lab coat or the doctor who has objective information that helps to heal us, not the person in clerical garb, broadly speaking, right? Unless you're from a religious background. And I think Nietzsche is onto that too. The asceticism in science that Dan's bringing out, it's a kind of limited asceticism. It brings insights and knowledge, but not in tempering the will and the desire to control and modify and make subject to human whims or unquestioned sort of desires. So yes, going all the way back to the beginning of Dan's comments, the aestheticization that I have in mind is not at all a return to unbridled desires or something like that. And that's why Shaler was helpful. So part of why Shaler is so helpful in that first section, it's the love of absolute value in being manifested through particular places and individuals and so forth. Yes, I think it's a great project, and I need to keep thinking more about it. I appreciate the comments, Dan. We got to keep talking about this. Yeah.
An important part of what happens at Socratic is conversation, and we'd like for you to be a part of the conversation. Ideally, we'd like to hear a question or two or three from students first, so we'll give students a chance to begin with. If you're a student and have a question for either of our speakers or both of them, maybe Dan, you can join. Sure, yeah. Chandler up here. So questions, please.
Elijah.
You guys can, since I'm looking the wrong direction.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there you go.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. When you were talking about, in the sense of value and being, we must love it absolutely. Can you give us a practical understanding of how to value something and be who we're meant to be? But it seems in a way that it has to be in a relationship, but we're in a world where we're no longer in a relationship, or we don't understand what it means to be in a relationship. So can you give us more of a practical example or elaboration on how to manifest value in being, like in everyday practices, especially in a world of disconnect?
Thanks for that question, Elijah. That's a great question. I'm not sure exactly what Shaler would say at this point. I have more reading of Shaler to go, but for me, there's a fundamental connection between goodness and truth, and appreciating or reverencing the goodness of a thing is recognizing that it is good for that thing to exist, to continue in existence. Of course, there's going back to one of the books I had up here, Erzen Kohak, this personalist account of being in nature. It's called The Embers and the Stars, the embers of the fire, the stars above the campfire. He delivers a kind of personalist account of our relation to nature, first person phenomenological account. And he has a line in the book that I think is telling here. He says that the fundamental question when we're considering reality is personal or impersonal. Is the cosmos meaningfully oriented? Is there a larger sense of personhood present in and maybe behind the cosmos? Does it come through the cosmos? Is there a fundamental goodness to being? Or is reality, the cosmos, fundamentally impersonal? He says that's that's the first question, that's the most basic question we have to answer, And I would side with the personal element. Yeah. And as a consequence, I think that getting to know individual things is getting to know God.
When you were talking about anacarnation, you were saying it's a return to embodiment without sacrificing the best that technology has to offer. How are we determining what that best is? Because that could be very subjective.
Yes, certainly it could be. Have I thought of any parameters of inquiry? Criteria that would weed out bad instances of technology from good instances? If technology makes us more fully human, it's good. If it doesn't, it's bad. I'm bringing in here Shaler's moral precondition for philosophical knowing, and I'm assuming a kind of Aristotelian account of the virtuous judge in this case. What distinguishes good technology from bad technology? It'll require a lot of practical wisdom in individual cases. I'm just like, cases are popping into my head. There's so many individual instances where we'd have to judge differently between cases.
Maybe an example.
Can I give one while you're thinking?
Yeah.
I think the bicycle is a fantastic invention. It's high tech and it requires international globalized trade. You can't have a bike until you have rubber from Brazil. And these are a precision. So it's not like a low tech technology, but it helps you to come to know the contours of your landscape. You know the directions of the wind. You know when the sun rises and when it sets. These are all things that are opened up through the technology. So it develops relationship to place, to the beauty and goodness of the natural world. And I think you can compare that favorably to something like a car as an example of ways that technology opens up and connects relations. At the same time as creating a more, so it's an environmental talk, but sometimes we think about environmental activism as sacrificing our good for some abstract good of the planet. But here's a case where technology emits less carbon and makes your life better. Is that an example?
Yeah, that's a great one. I have a digital example. Technology that manipulates our desire to be in community with each other, that warps our relationality to each other and makes our relations abstract rather than more interpersonal. I have in mind like social media algorithms that sort of manipulate our basic psychology to keep us viewing, keep us scrolling for hours, making companies that run them more money. This is a bad technology in the sense that it doesn't make us more fully human. It makes us less happy, less connected to one another and to the larger cosmos of which we're a part, by and large. So that the element of making us less fully human there, I think, serves as a criterion.
Are there any consequences of embodiment, if that's what we're trying to get at, if that's what we're trying to focus on and sort of get towards? It seems to me that, like, doesn't it seem like if we put scientific aestheticism, like you were saying, or this material aestheticism, even that can have some problems with will, as you were saying. So I'm always a little bit like precarious of trying to go to an extreme and then see and then sort of get totally caught in that extreme and you can't see anything else. So I guess that's what I would say.
So are there any consequences to overemphasizing embodiment at the expense of the mind or intellectualism?
Yeah, as opposed to trying to become disembodied, as opposed to trying to get at the objective or the scientific rather than the subjective.
No, just kidding. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, certainly in environmental philosophy, I think Dan and I both have seen an overemphasis on embodiment as a reactionary, as a kind of reaction. Maybe the talk is giving that impression, but in my larger work, I'm not trying to give that much of an impression. In fact, I'm trying to, in defending our unique responsibility, I have to acknowledge the contemplative element of us as human animals. Our sort of unique ability to take responsibility for our actions and to construct wisely. So yes, I do think there are consequences to overemphasizing embodiment at the expense of the intellect, or maybe the disembodied intellect or something like that. But the talk is essentially, with the early Nietzsche, pinpointing some excesses and trying to shift the pendulum further in the other direction. So maybe overemphasizing aesthetics and embodiment and so forth, so as to land in a happier medium. Harmonize the extremes, yeah. Just say.
When you were mentioning Lynn White Jr.'s skepticism or his lack of appreciation for Christianity, what immediately came to mind for me was the commission from God to fill the earth and subdue it. And perhaps he was pushing back against this tendency to view ourselves as a certain kind of superior over it and over nature. But when Dr. Bradley was mentioning this sort of creative, and it says being co-creators with God and filling the earth and subduing it, has so much to do with that, engagement with our environment, using our human genius to truly appreciate what God has given us. That seems to definitely be a healing for that tendency. I'm reading a paper that related to your class by a man named Crispin Sartwell, who's who has a real distaste for that, because it seems that any level of superiority that we view in ourselves over the rest of creation is inevitably going to lead to this destructive and exploitative behavior. And that's just a comment from me, but I'm wondering what's your take on that commission to fill the earth and subdue it, and what is our place specifically as the greatest animal?
Great question. Thanks, Josiah. Humans are animals, get over it. That's the title of the article, right? Crispin Sartwell? Yeah, which is the kind of standard position in the circles that I'm reading in, right? It's humble the human animal by ontologically humbling the human animal. Right. There's a kind of flattening. Humans are no different than other animals, to which I'm responding. And it's precisely not just fill the earth and subdue it, not just subduing, but a vision of dominion. Right. Not as domination, which in practice, dominion has often been worked out as, of course, as domination. But the ideal of a new heavens and new earth, the ideal of the kingdom of God coming to, the title and subtitle of this talk, bringing healing down to earth. The ideal is a vision of dominion that is not dominating. It's one of service. Yeah. Bringing out the fullness of the being of those who are under the care of this human species. That's what I'm aiming at, is a fuller vision of communion. Yeah.
Dominion is a metaphor that comes from a feudal worldview. So there's a lot that's going on there. Part of it is the early modern rejection of feudalism, and part of it is reacting against the exit. If you have in mind King Louis XIV or whatever, or your model is not what it is was the language that was used there. If you're thinking about kingship or queenship as responsibility for your people, you're going to get a different model from that line in Genesis. In my own ancestors' tradition among the Celts, if things went wrong, the king was ritually executed and buried in the bog. That's why we find their bodies. So it's not at all that the king owns the people. It's a much more of a notion of care and responsibility for them.
That brings me back to Plato and the Republic. The true shepherd is the shepherd who lays down their life for the sheep. That's not the Republic, but that's going a little bit beyond. But the ideal shepherd, right? The Freudian speech shepherd. Yeah.
Another famous
That's the
text.
baptized Plato.
Hi, Mark.
We live, human beings today live in urban areas. The vast majority of the human population live in urban areas. We're more separated from the biosphere as a species than we've ever been in human history. And we're bound to stay that way. So my question comes on that point of appreciating in a positive way our animal quality, of appreciating the rest of nature. We live in cities or large towns. We live in a commercial dependency toward the import of energy and goods and services into these towns and the export of our pollution. So how do we, I mean, I'm being a bit of a materialist. How does humanity get to a sensitivity of nature when everything in our daily lives pretty well forces us from that? And that there is no prospect of 8 billion people living in rural areas across the planet. We're going to be 8 billion shortly. And an awful lot of those people are poor by anybody's standard. They need to consume more. And the planet is having a tough enough time with the level of consumption and destruction now. So, sorry, but that's a kind of political economy. Thank you. But that's where it is. It seems there was once there's an historian over in Brigham Young who wrote a lovely book, The Environmental History of Latin America, and he comes to this conclusion that humanity will, quote unquote, save itself from environmental disaster with how it lives in its cities. Or it will fail. So, I think my parents' generation and their parents' generation were closer connection to the daily lives of plants and animals than my crowd and this crowd is. So it's a kind of question, all the points you made seem to me helpful. But then I think of the social, cultural realities that we live in, immersed in, do not reinforce us towards the directions that you and others say humanity needs to go to avoid the worst of the climate disaster and to avoid other disasters we continually inflict on ourselves, namely war and degradation of human beings.
That's a great, multifaceted question. Excellent question. Dan? I have a couple responses. The first thought that comes to mind with cities is Jane Jacobs. Are you familiar with Jane Jacobs? I was at BC and she gave a couple of talks at BC before my time there in the 80s and I think 90s. The Lonergan folks kept inviting her back to give talks on economics and for some of them, economics in the larger natural realm, thinking about environmental and economic questions together. She's got a newer, her big work, I believe I'm getting this right, is The Life and Death of American Cities, her most famous work. But she's recently written, probably among other things, a kind of dialogue called The Nature of Economies, I believe. I might be getting that wrong. That's just off the top of my head. But she's thinking along these lines as well. What would it mean to construct our cities with the larger cosmological context in view? And just at the most basic kind of level, I'm thinking about, well, what I'm talking about here is a shift in individual perspective, really, a shift in our individual relations to things, and you're broadening us out to this important dimension of our how such shifts in thinking among individuals would begin to affect economic realities and larger political realities and such, realities in the polis. And I appreciate that.
Let me pose a follow-up to, because say if one remembers that first Earth Day back in the 70s here, and this massive outflowing of participation of people all across the United States and elsewhere, but it turned out to be a short-term episode. There hasn't been a real conversion to a way of life that would modify excessive consumption and are wandering off into electronic amusements. Escape. So, and that was some kind of my generation. I was a college student when the first Earth Day was done. No, I was in high school. So, the social, I have a quarrel with saying it's a focus on the individual. Because the individual lives and moves and has his or her being in a social and cultural forces and drives and allurements.
Fair. One point that you alluded to, perhaps, ecological conversion, and on a larger scale, and within religious institutions.
I'm sorry.
Within religious institutions, the becoming aware, of individuals, yes, but of broader social entities, becoming aware of the ways in which our actions are affecting those outside of our immediate vicinity, and we live in this broader environmental context and so forth. Environmental conversion broadly is going to be a shift in thinking is going to be a necessary, and seeing the world, a necessary part of the environmental solution, essentially. I also think part of that conversion will be seeing simplicity as a good thing, not as Dan already mentioned this, I'm just realizing, but as a component of understanding who we are and what we are as persons, simplicity being a vital element of that understanding.
There is hope. We used to think that we had to choose between urban and nature. I mean, you think of science fiction movies up to Blade Runner, there's not a speck of grass anywhere in the city. But we're going to have the living world integrated into our skyscrapers. You know, we can have the kind of futuristic cities now are going to be green walls and all kinds of animals and plants. We're not going to have spotted owls in the cities, but there's going to be lots of squirrels and, grass. So there's ways that they can mix together. So people are even paying for it. These greenways now raise the value of people's property, and so integrated into the urban.
Well, but all of that needs to happen much more quickly and across the planet.
Yeah.
Particularly in high-consuming countries like this one, a hell of a lot faster than pizza. We're still burning off more energy every year.
Yeah.
Fair.
Than we were years before.
Yeah, fair.
So it's not a quarrel, but it's sense of those ambitions and points you laid out are very attractive. And I'm sympathetic. But we've got to kick ass a lot more than we've done so far. As a group of people, particularly individual.
Thanks. Joe.
So, Chandler, thanks for this. I want to push back a little bit on the first characteristic on anesthetization, the emphasis on embodiment, or sort of a more holistic picture of encounter with nature as opposed to the sort of privileging of the ocular encounter. And this relates to the question of embodiment. To emphasize embodiment is already an intellectual thing. It's an emphasis on the actual embodied thing.
Sure.
Right, so you're already moving into the space of a theoretical appropriation of your encounter with the natural world and saying it needs to be more embodied. That in itself is an intellectual argument. It's not actually being embodied. So the same thing goes then for the critique of the ocular. So there can be a tendency, to be sure, in a certain kind of scientific rationality that's predicated upon the assumption that the good to be pursued is manipulation and control, which has an origin at least in Machiavelli. But that's not all of science. So there are a lot of scientists who just talk about the experience of wonder. And the thing that catches them up in the inquiry is just the question itself. I want to figure out how this works. Not for any reason other than figuring out how it works. Not unlike the way that we interact with other people. We become friends with other people. We learn about them just from a desire to know them. Hopefully not to manipulate them, unless you're Machiavelli.
It sounds like the appreciation of value in being and humbling of the ego. There's a kind of philosophical
So that's already
component.
there in a certain respect. So why did it happen? This shift in the early modern period from an encounter with the natural order as a sacramental or sacred encounter to an encounter with the natural order as something to be manipulated and controlled. There's already a sort of shift in the intellectual horizon of culture at the time. What is that? So there, on the one hand, there's still some good that the scientist is after that's not just, how can I use this to manipulate? There's an element of prediction, insofar as modern science has predictive, right? Modeling is part of this, what it is, it's methodology. But there's also something more basic underneath. The question.
The elimination of final causality.
Yeah.
Descartes.
Yeah.
Descartes of Aristotle.
Right.
Yeah. The thing doesn't have a good to be pursued on its own anymore. It's extended thing to be manipulated and controlled and understood by me, the intellectual thing.
So do we attribute that to Descartes' Jesuit education?
Well, I think they initially resisted there was some resistance, right, among Jesuit theologians to the meditations. Like I said, immeasurable advances in science and later in science and technology based on this understanding of the body more objectively as an extended thing, but at a cost, and overemphasized at what cost. I think we're pinpointing that. Yeah. Is that? I mean, Descartes is maybe the tip of the iceberg for the intellectual shift of his day and the science of his day.
Underneath there that already is happening around the same time.
Yeah.
When the scientists write in their reports, they purify it of all that wonder. That's what drew them to the field in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think there's a real tension between the way scientists experience their wonder and the way they theorize their own philosophy of science.
Oh.
But it seems to me that this is all from taking Galilean Newtonian physics as the model. It's not just formal. It has something to do with the content. And there's a lot of excitement, I think, around, we can kind of give a litany of people. Lynn Margot's first saying in the 1970s, if we take biology as our model of the natural world, nature's going to look very different than when we look at physics. Vandana Shiva says if we look at the subatomic quantum level, that's beyond my pay grade. But she's saying something similar. If we look at the quantum relations, we're not going to get a Newtonian world. Latour says if we look at the sociology of technology, we're going to get a different view of nature. So I think from lots of different angles, we're seeing scientists re-theorizing their own understanding of what they're doing.
You have two questions here, here, and here. The student right here.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, Dr. Bradley, you mentioned sex and food when it comes to things that we objectify to make our relationship a little more objective, more pleasurable. I think, well, that is a footnote, but social media should be part of that conversation. I think it's on par with both rampancy and detriment to the solution you provide for anonymity, which is the appreciation of the individual and the individual creature, including other humans. I think it sort of impersonalizes the relationship between humans. But I'd like to hear more of your opinion on in a culture of performance that we're in nowadays, both online and in person. Does the performance ever really end when we get off social media nowadays, now that that sort of expectation has been set by both just social media and each other? And if the expression of self for an audience in our culture is so deified, celebrities and things like that, if it's possible for that to sort of shift back in our culture, or this is sort of a snowball that's going to continue to make this problem of impersonalization with nature and with each other is going to make it worse.
Sure. I mean, I think that there's often a learning curve in terms of how to manage new technologies. It's okay to drink and drive when you're driving a Model T Ford and there's no one else on the road and you're going 20 miles an hour. And we had a lot of deaths in the 60s and 70s when cars got fast. And now we learned that you can't drink alcohol while you're driving your car. I think there's a lot of self-discipline that's going to happen in our culture. I have a 15 and a 13-year-old, and that's the age that's suffering this kind of the most. But I think, we're going to learn about putting in place some restrictions and rules on this social technology that's going to mitigate some of the worst effects. And everyone's talking, it's in the New York Times, we're all talking about it, right? And one way to overcome that or to balance that is a stronger material connection to people, right? When you learn what kind of food people like, you're learning about them and you're learning about the world, and your relationship with them is then mediated by your connectivity to materiality. So I think there's ways to kind of temper and balance that. But I think your point is really well taken, that there is a great deal of anonymity that comes from internet technologies, which is a kind of titillation of the senses, but in a really disembodied sort of way, right?
Yeah, and you feel it. You feel it if you've been scrolling on Facebook, or not Facebook anymore, Instagram or TikTok for 4 hours, and you feel like, I just wasted 4 hours of my time and I learned nothing and I'm no better for it, And to that end, as a supplement, so increasing awareness and legislation, yes, legislation for sure, and demands on the part of consumers for sure at a political level, but also individual awareness and education. A lot of us are trying to raise awareness of these problems in our classrooms because, of course, what 18-year-old isn't on social media and isn't suffering in some aspects, flourishing maybe through others and getting to know people better in some cases, but in other cases, more frustrated than if they weren't, if they were more aware of the problem and able to step back. So I'm encouraged. I'm optimistic that education plays a big role in this too.
And I think we have to be patient with ourselves and recognize that we're social creatures. You can't opt out completely. As a parent, I would love to have just said, we're not going to do phones, we're not going to do anything, but I don't have an Amish community that I could plug into.
You didn't have a phone for a long time.
Yes, but then with kids, it's like, I don't mind being a little more countercultural myself, but even, for kids, you have to find ways to recognize that you're going to suffer under some of the limitations of your generational trauma, and not to worry, not to be overly panicked about it, I think, right? And to recognize that the culture is working out these problems.
Thanks. Great question. Vincenzo.
So we understand the importance of through your talk. We understand the importance now of stepping away from complicated society to get more in touch with nature, get more in touch with ourselves. At what point in society, I guess in the U.S. especially, at what point did we draw the connection that complicated society kind of hinders our ability to connect with ourselves? At what point, because like with materialism, with industrial revolution, with all these things contributing to a better life, but also a more complicated life, at one point did we realize that it may be a detriment to us?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's been, I'm tempted to go back just a few hundred years to the Romantics in sort of reaction or in resistance to the Enlightenment overemphasis maybe on reason seen from a certain perspective. The sort of Romantic response is to emphasize the meaningfulness of emotion in response, undervalued emotion. C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man, similar line of thought. In some ways, the subjectivization of beauty and that sort of thing. But I think there's sort of, for some, there's always been a tension between returning to a more simple kind of individualistic vision of nature, and being in the city with all of its pluses, you know, and the solution for someone like Thoreau is to leave the city and go out into the wilderness for a few years and write about it. But what I think we're both advocating here is it can't be leave the city, return to the wilderness. It has to be a broader vision of what the good life looks like and what the good that would bring more harmony to society and nature would look like. And that's a vision of human and cosmological flourishing. It's a vision of cities that aren't anti-nature, cities that integrate the biotic environment and the biosphere of which they're a part. And a lot of research is showing that cities are affected by the ecosystems that they're a part of, even unacknowledged. Like, so knowing these things will help. Being aware of these broader dimensions will help those who are constructing to construct more meaningfully and more with the cosmological dimension of our existence more in view. Want to say things? Mark.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I agree with a lot of it. I think there's a question about how you're characterizing science that would be fun to talk about later, but it's a specific question I had for you. That the one thing that I kept bristling at during your talk was this metaphor that I'm a guest and the host. And I don't know what work that does for you. It seems to be in tension with the idea of incarnation. I'm not a guest. I'm a product of nature. My incarnation is, if you want to talk about how I am embodied, I don't know where else you would want to look. I mean, everything I know about myself comes from, including my ability to know God, comes from having a brain that can know God. And so I just don't know. I don't know what that host guest distinction does for you. It seems like it doesn't fit.
That's a really, I think, fair point, and maybe I'll need to. It's a good suggestion to think more critically about using that metaphor at the beginning and the end, especially intro and conclusion. The volume is called Hosting Earth, that this chapter is a part of. So it's the theme is eco-hospitality, and it's basically picking up themes from this philosopher colleague friend of ours who has written a lot on hospitality, hosting the stranger, and these themes. And now he's applying these themes to the environmental questions, the environmental crisis. And so I'm sort of echoing the main themes that tie the book together to hopefully make a more seamless project as an edited volume. But I think that's a fair point. And as you're saying it, being guests of Earth and this sort of thing, being guests makes us seem sort of maybe could be taken to overemphasize again the intellect at the expense of our embodiment or something. You know, it's like reifying the disconnect just to say we're a guest and not a part of Earth.
Mark, just one tiny little follow-on. This Richard Carney was part of the peace talks in the Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and so for a lot of what he's doing is trying to. He's still part of the early days of the return of religion into the academy, and so he's acutely aware of the way religion can create violence, and so hospitality is a really important way for him of disarming the worst the danger within religiosity to outgroup, and it's very much about welcoming people into a religious community as a central part of. Wow. And so he calls on the ancient traditions of the Hebrew spirituality, which is also tied to materiality, because to welcome someone means you have to prepare food for them. And so it's doing a few different things, and one of them is tying them to the body and care for the other in their physicality. So thanks.
I actually, Mark, I think I agree with you, although I'm not familiar with this literature, but I wonder, I'm teaching a class on Kierkegaard now, so I have to think I'm already primed to think in Kierkegaardian categories about, especially thinking dialectically about this question, where it seems like you could say, Mark, that you start with a notion of the human place in nature is a place of continuity, that we're just part of nature. But I can see how you could argue that this notion of hospitality and the guest is a dialectical move to make where you are, in a way, alienating yourself from the continuity, but you're alienating yourself in a way to note something that you highlighted at the beginning, that human beings are, in an important sense, discontinuous with the rest of nature. There isn't any other part of nature that we know that reflects on its place in nature. And it seems the value of this dialectical move is we acknowledge a human discontinuity while at the same time acknowledging that discontinuity can be understood, again, as a dialectical move.
Yeah.
So you retain continuity, but you also allow for discontinuity.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful. I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. Kierkegaard is always informing the earliest things I've written are Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard's always shaping my thought, even if I'm not writing on him. And this is kind of echoing one of the themes that I've thought a lot about in Kierkegaard, this dialectic that inherited from Hegel, immediacy, mediation, second immediacy, and Kierkegaard calls faith a second immediacy. Paul Ricoeur picks this up, this thinker that influenced Carney and both Dan and I. Paul Ricoeur picks this up, and he writes an essay called Religion, Atheism, and Faith, in which he argues similarly for sort of initially, if you're religious by default, it's oftentimes out of fear, and I forget the other term he uses, but a kind of like inherited religiosity. And Ricoeur argues that this night of atheism is a necessary dialectical kind of moment to give way to a more robust embodied faith. And that's kind of straight out of Kierkegaard, that kind of three-part structure. Maybe De Silencio and Fear and Trembling is in that middle stage of doubt and anxiety, and then faith is that thing he sees but can't quite see himself as a part of yet, or at that stage. This is informing what I'm writing here, and I have an article coming out called Estranged Kinship, and this is exactly what I'm pointing to in the human-animal relation. Merleau-Ponty, this thinker I mentioned, in phenomenology, has this phrase or this quote that mythical thinking is our best way into thinking the strange kinship between human and animal. And in that paper that I've been working on for a while, I'm looking at I'm sort of emphasizing in response to Merleau-Ponty the estrangement that makes human responsibility possible. There's the kinship, yes, that's the first moment, the continuity, but then there's a moment of estrangement, and it's that estrangement, that separation, that makes the relation of a rightful dominus kind of relation, a lordship, responsibility for stewardship, not lordship, but stewardship is the right term I'm looking for. It makes that kind of responsibility possible. That's exactly what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
I think we're out of time. Let's thank our speakers again, please.